Hello, and welcome to World History 1102. I'm Professor James Semen. This is the lecture for Friday, March 6th, for week 7 of the course, the Industrial Revolution. Last time, we were talking about the spread of the Industrial Revolution from its origins in England and Scotland to other places that adopted industrialization early on. That would include certain parts of continental Europe, like Belgium, northern France, and the Ruhr Valley of Germany, and also the northern United States. What I want to talk briefly about now is something a place very far afield from Europe and from the Atlantic world of the United States and Europe, and that is industrialization in Japan. For Japan was the only non-Western country to adopt industrialization early on, basically by the latter years of the 19th century. And Japan's history, though in many ways very different from that of Europe, followed similar patterns. In the 1600s, you get a slowly consolidating centralized state known as the shogunate, run by a military leader known as a shogun. The emperor in Japan was always sort of a distant figurehead with no real power. It was a quasi-military state with strong interest in keeping the local lords of the land, similar to the barons and lords of Europe, or daimyo as they were called in Japan, and their warrior vassals, the samurai, who were kind of the equivalent of knights in Japanese society, in check. They wanted to kind of keep them under control, and this produced a long period of conflict in the 1600s. But despite this, Japan began to develop its own capitalist system in the 1600s, similar to Europe. You had better agricultural methods that led to population growth, which led to more internal trade and the development of towns. For example, the town of Himeji, a castle and town shown here in Japan in the 1700s. You also had, as in England, you also had a long tradition of skilled craftsmen who formed guilds to protect markets and production, much like guilds did in Europe. Leads to clusters of hand industry in certain towns. You also get the development of financial markets. These were often controlled, different than in Europe, where the Christian church sort of frowned upon the loaning and borrowing of money due to certain Christian principles. But of course, Japan was not a Christian country, and there much of the financing was controlled by religious institutions, as they were trusted by all kinds of different people. People left their money with them for safekeeping, and then these religious institutions would lend it out. You also had an increasingly powerful government in Japan in the 1700s that establishes roads, that increased national markets and allow workers to move to where the jobs are. But the difference then in Europe was that in Japan, the development of larger and larger industry, larger and larger businesses, was much more oriented around the family. In Europe, it was basically the development of corporations, development of big businesses was largely premised on the idea of joint stock companies like the East India Company, which we've talked about before, or the Virginia Company when we were talking about the settlement of the Americas. But in Japan, it was a lot of these were family-owned, large extended family-owned companies. And these family-owned companies became quite large, much like joint stock companies. They developed close relationships with those religious institutions that provided them financing. They also took a very different approach to their labor force. In Europe, the labor force was seen as, hired people under a free contract system. You hired people, they signed a contract to work for you. In Japan, it was a little bit different. The companies began to sort of saw their labor force as kind of an extended family, kind of like the medieval lord saw the serfs on his lands. And so it was a very kind of different laboring system, much more oriented towards the family, and then in terms of the corporation itself, and then it treated its workforce sort of like a family in terms of asking, demanding of them not just their labor, but also that they show loyalty to the company, they practice good morals, that they practice frugality and be economical in their own lives. In other words, it was a much more of a paternalistic approach to their labor force that developed in Japan. And of course, that still exists in many Japanese corporations today, that There's still a lot of Japanese corporations have their origins. A lot of Japanese corporations even today have their origins in family businesses, and they still, in many cases, treat their labor forces in a kind of paternalistic way, where they sort of oversee not just the workers aren't just seen as hired workers under an employment contract, but as part of this corporate family. And indeed, even some of the most well-known brands in Japan today, particularly in the food sector, things like the company Kikkoman or Gekkeikan, the sake company, which you can see there, both of these companies' wares in every supermarket and liquor store, even here in Los Angeles, that these all date from this period in the 1600s and 1700s when these big family-owned businesses take their start. And these big companies lay the foundations of Japan's capitalist system. By the early 1800s, Japan has a solidly capitalist system with these big companies involved in trade and the production of food products for mass markets around Japan, using the transportation system, the road networks that is established by this centralized government, the shogun. You have by the early 1800s a largely skilled worker base, highly literate. Many Japanese know how to read and write in this era. A well-developed financial sector, a large population of people, a well-developed national market for goods. But at the same time, Japanese was unusual. It was different than what was going on in Europe, in the sense that Japan, for political reasons that we don't need to go into, had basically closed itself off, sealed itself off from the larger world. That came to an abrupt end in 1853 with the visit of Commodore Matthew Perry, an American naval commander, who sailed a fleet of modern war steamships from the American Navy and merchant ships into Edo, now Tokyo, harbor in 1853. The arrival of this fleet basically terrifies and wakes up the ruling class and the ruling elite of Japan, who begin to worry that Japan has fallen behind the West. They see what's been going on in China. They've kept their eyes open to what's going on in China, where the British basically forced open Chinese ports to the opium trade through the use of military force in the so-called Opium Wars of the 1830s and 40s. And Japan, its sort of leadership becomes determined that they're going to avoid this fate that China has faced, something we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. And they decide to learn from the West, learn everything they can from the West. And one of the things they decide to learn from the West is that they're going to adopt industrial techniques and industrial methods that they see the West has, that has produced things like these modern steamships that are far in advance of anything that the Japanese have. And the first thing they do is, within a few years, is they overthrow the old shogunate, this military state that had ruled Japan for a couple hundred years, and replace it with a much more modern national state, some of it modeled after, not exactly a democracy, but representative of the basic power interests of Japan. They sort of create a strong central state, a strong national identity, and because their main desire is not to be dominated by the West. And of course, Japan has a long tradition of learning from the outside, primarily from China over the centuries. It has adopted many things from China. And so there's a long tradition of learning from outside cultural sources and then adapting it to their own unique culture. And that's exactly what they do in the late 19th century. Japanese send delegations around the world to learn what they consider the best attributes of the different nations that they go visit. They visit the United States to kind of see what our industrialization process is. They go to Britain to sort of study their industrialization and their political system, and they adopt what they consider to be the best of those systems and the ways that will fit in with Japanese culture. Here, for example, is the Japanese delegation in a Japanese drawing visiting New York City in 1860. And they learn from their visits. They learn about modern, sort of the various things that Europeans and Americans have developed over the, in the century preceding these visits. They begin to diligently adopt everything, the idea of national constitutions, public school systems, modern banks. They adopt the best of Western technology. They develop a national army. All those samurai knights are turned into officers in this new military, but it's a somewhat different economic system than what develops in the West. The government takes a much more central role in directing the economy and directing economic development. Many of the old lords, the old daimyo, who kind of the feudal lords of Japan, end up becoming, through their government connections, end up becoming the heads of major family corporations. And these family companies that they run begin to modernize themselves, utilize new corporate bureaucracies and management systems to make themselves more efficient. And they basically begin to imitate the corporations of the West. And in the last decades of the 19th century, Japan goes from, a solid economic system, one that is, somewhat prosperous enough, to a world-class industrial powerhouse by 1900, a very rapid evolution to the very first ranks of industrial powers in the world. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, there is growing, by the late 19th century, there is growing industrialization in many other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, even in places as sort of economically backward as Russia begin to industrialize. And what begins to happen, Britain begins to become overtaken. As you can see from this chart, early on in the industrialization process, Britain, of course, is the greatest industrial power. But by 1900, it has become surpassed by other powers, most particularly by the United States and also by a rising Germany, which emerges as a centralized state in 1871. And it is during this second half of the 19th century that historians speak of a second industrial revolution. The first one was marked by iron, steel, textiles, and the beginning of railroads. The second one, in the late 19th century, is marked much more by steel production, by the rapid expansion of railroads, and by the application of electricity, and ultimately things like automobiles and oil. And then after World War II, you get the spread of an industrial economy based on the production of consumer goods, the kind of industrial economy that most of us are familiar with today. You even get in places like the Soviet Union and later China, an industrialization on a model that is very much controlled by the state in these communist governments, in these communist countries, where the industrialization process is very much directed by the state rather than by capitalist forces. But as we know, of course, today, China, the most rapidly industrializing country in the world the last few decades, has kind of done a mixed model of state control and private enterprise. And as we know, the Industrial Revolution is responsible. The Industrial Revolution under capitalism has produced one of the greatest advances in standards of living in human history, the greatest advance in human living standards in the history of the world. All of us enjoy the abundance and modern products and modern technology that this capitalist industrial system has created. Few of us, I think, as much as we may romanticize about a pre-industrial world, few of us would want to live in that world of want and need and hunger that most people lived in a pre-industrial world. The pre-industrial world that's lack of goods, shortages, miserable living conditions for the average person. But at the same time, the industrialization process has had its problems, and those who do not necessarily benefit from the industrial process, at least not immediately. As we're going to see, the two main the two groups of people that suffer badly from the Industrial Revolution, especially early on. One is the working classes of industrial countries. The other is peasants and craft workers in the rest of the world that is impacted by the imperial expansion of Europe, the imperial expansion of Europe made possible by industrialization. But before we get into sort of the awful work, the miseration of working people in industrialized countries, the harsh working conditions that they were forced to labor under in the late 19th century, I do want to talk about some sort of general stuff about what industrialization does. It basically kind of changes everything. It changes people's notions of how time works. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people most people lived and existed and did their work on farms under a natural kind of time clock, right? The sun rose, you went to work in the fields. Midday, you might rest under the when the sun was at its peak, and then as it darkened towards dusk, you might go home. You might go back to your home, and you followed kind of the rhythms of nature. There were the seasons, of course, when you did different tasks. There was the harvest season, there was the planting season, and all that kind of thing. So you lived by kind of a natural clock. With the Industrial Revolution, of course, you have the advent of new ideas about time. People now had to understand that they worked by a clock. They had to be at a certain place at a certain time. They had to work for a certain number of hours. And to sort of discipline this labor force that was unused to these kinds of time schedules, some of the early factories like that at the Lowell Mills in Massachusetts, which hired a lot of young girls, young farm girls to work the looms in these textile mills. They had elaborate bell systems that would notify all the women who were living in dormitories. They built these dormitories in these Lowell mills to house these women, because these mills, because they ran on water power, had to be away from urban areas where people might be able to live, find apartments and living places of their own. So they built dormitories for them, and they disciplined their lives with these elaborate systems of clocks and bells to kind of condition them to the idea that you had to be at a certain place at a certain time. And of course, this also happens outside the workplace with the advent of railroads, which had to run on strict schedules. And of course, so basically, industrialization sort of disciplines people to follow the clock in a way that they had never done before. Another thing that industrialization does is it kind of remakes the family, particularly the family of those who were employed in industry. And we talked earlier about some of the early factories using young women and children. But as industrialization became more and more widespread, increasingly it relied on an adult male workforce. And what began to happen was, under the old, when people lived on farms, everybody contributed to the production of the farms. The men might be out in the fields raising the food, but the women were the ones who processed that food into finished products that they could consume in the household or maybe sell in the market. But it was a joint enterprise. All people contributed, including the children. With the Industrial Revolution, you begin to kind of get the separation of spheres, so that with men going off to work in the factories and women began staying home to raise the children, you get this sexual division of labor. And gradually, by the late 19th century, there's also sort of the elimination of children from the factory as child labor begins to become seen as an immoral thing, that children need to have their time for nurturing and growing up, and it begins to disappear. And you begin to get this sort of separation, this definition that work is a man's world and the home is a woman's world. And that's part of that is a creation of the Industrial Revolution, that idea that persists really until the post-World War II era in places like the United States and Europe, where those kind of defined spheres of women at home and men at work began to collapse in the post-World War II era. But for 100 years, from the Industrial Revolution until the post-World War II era, this idea of work as the man's sphere and home as the woman's sphere prevailed in much of the West, and it was a product of the industrialization movement. But let us talk about working conditions now for a moment. Take a look at the work forces in these early factories. Conditions in early factories were pretty awful. Filthy, noisy, very unsafe, lots of injuries. But what really upset people the most was the discipline, the fixed hours, the relentless pace. There was no taking a break. You had to continue working. Basically, the machines dictated the pace of work. You were subservient to a machine and also to an overseer. Workers oftentimes likened it to slavery. And in the early years, factory owners had to offer decent wages, and they still could not get enough workers. People preferred to do cottage industry, although that was increasingly becoming obsolete in the face of factory competition. Or they preferred agriculture. There were not enough workers, as industries had to be in places where there was water power. So many of the early factory workforces literally were like slaves. They were oftentimes inmates in workhouses, that is, places where the poor of England who couldn't support themselves were housed by various government entities, and there they were forced to work, and increasingly forced to work in industrial settings. They basically, were almost like slaves within the system, or prisoners, really would be a more accurate description. And many of them, of course, as we talked about before, many of them were orphans or abandoned children who worked in these factories. But with the rise of steam power, factories increasingly located to cities and more populated area where there were much more plentiful adult workers to work in the factories, adult men to work in the factories. And so with that move, governments began, particularly England and the United States, began to move against child labor and set limits on what kind of work women could do. And increasingly factory work became more for adult men. And as steam power allowed factories to locate basically anywhere there was a workforce in urban areas or in places where where cities grew up quite rapidly, for example, in the English Midlands or in the mid-Atlantic states of the United States, or in industrial parts of Belgium, France, and Germany. These cities, these urban environments that were filled with factories were quite miserable places to live. They were polluted, crowded, disease-ridden. All around, workers generally did not benefit. And this is not surprising, as competition and desire for growth led factories to cut wages to the bone, speed things up, and lengthen hours and plow profits back into expansion to keep ahead of competition. And in these conditions, in these working class conditions, you begin to get sort of a new mentality, a new way of looking at society among many working people. And that is that many began to sort of see themselves as, this kind of almost like a slave labor force to those who owned the factories. And they resented the fact that there was a growing immiseration of the working classes, that there was that as businesses and capitalists were competing with one another to stay afloat in a highly competitive market. As owners of these big factories and these big businesses, they're constantly in competition with each other. Everybody's trying to outproduce the other one, and it's causing profit margins to diminish. And one of the few things that business owners have control over. They don't have control over the price of their resources. They have to buy whatever raw materials they have at whatever market prices are given. The rent they pay on their factories has to be the same. But the one thing they can cut back on, one thing they have control over, is the workforce. They can cut wages. They can speed up production. They can dispense with any kind of safety measure. One of the earliest economists to sort of recognize this problem was an Englishman named David Ricardo, who wrote of what he called the iron law of wages. And he writes, in the natural advance of society, the wages of labor will have a tendency to fall as far as they are regulated by supply and demand. For the supply of laborers will continue to increase at the same rate, while the demand for them will increase at a slower rate. What he was basically saying was that in the face of competition among businesses, businessmen are going to try to lower wages to the absolute lowest point they can, because if they don't do that, their competitor will do that, and they will be driven out of business. So everybody's kind of in a race to the bottom in terms of the wages they paid, and a race to the bottom in terms of the speed of production and the length of hours they're demanding that their workers perform in order not to be outcompeted by their competitors, basically. And so he talked about this iron law of wages, this perpetual immiseration and impoverization of working people. And of course, you get Karl Marx in the middle of the 19th century, who argues, who takes up David Ricardo's theories and basically says that, eventually what's going to happen is that as the working classes are increasingly made more and more miserable, and they become larger and larger part of society, eventually they will have enough and overthrow the system, and you'll get a communist revolution, which of course doesn't happen in the heartland of industrialization, but only happens in sort of backwaters like Russia and later other countries like China. So how do workers respond to this problem of, finding themselves reduced to, the lowest possible pay, the longest hours, the high speed of production? Things are getting worse and worse. Well, one response was these group of people in England called the Luddites, named after a mythical character that supposedly led them, a guy named Ned Ludd. He was a fictional character that they kind of invented. And it was a movement in England in the 1810s and 20s to kind of stop industrialization in its process. And of course, it was focused in the textile industry, which we know, of course, was the first to industrialize in England. And their solution was a rather simple one. Let's just destroy the machines. And so for several years, these groups of Luddites, these sort of secret armies of workers, would go out in the night, armed. They'd break into factories. They'd break into workhouses where these new textile machines were being utilized, and these people who were kind of craft workers who had once been hand loom weavers at home and cottage industries tried to destroy the machines and end industrialization by just basically destroying industry itself. Obviously, that solution did not work. You can't destroy all the machines. The government cracked down on these people. The army was set in to break these things up, and the Luddite movement never took off. Although the word Luddite continues to be used in modern times to describe anybody who is opposed to new technology. But a more realistic approach to the problem was the formation of unions. Now, we have to understand that unions that prior to the Industrial Revolution, when you had handcraft industries, so you had, like, for example, shoe production in craft shops and small workshops, or you had, the making of iron implements in blacksmith shops. The way it would work was that many of these crafts, particularly in Europe, were organized into guilds, and these guilds included both the people who owned the workshops, the master craftsmen, and the journey workers, the actual people who worked, the men who worked in these shops. And then, of course, it also included the apprentices, the young boys and teenagers and so forth who were learning the trade. And they all kind of existed within these guilds together because they sort of shared interests together to preserve, to keep prices up, to keep the quality of goods up so they could charge the most premium prices, to eliminate if necessary, to regulate how many people could come into the craft in order to keep wages up, to keep prices up. That sort of was that all people within a craft had a shared sort of destiny. But industrialization destroyed that. For one thing, the old craft production was rendered obsolete. They couldn't compete with the much cheaper goods being made in factories. The other thing is that under the old craft model, the guild model, it was a very reasonable expectation that a young apprentice would eventually grow up, become a journey worker, learn the skills really well of his craft, and then eventually, if he saved capital and lived a life of frugality and didn't mess around too much, and didn't drink too much, he would be able to eventually put together enough capital to start his own craft shop. But with the advent of factories, of course, that became impossible, because to gather the capital to set up a factory with all of its equipment and all of its facilities was just simply out of the reach of most workers. And so what happened was the natural process of going from apprentice all the way up to master craftsman, owning your own shop, that model was destroyed by industrialization, because only the wealthy, the only merchants, only people with significant access to capital could create these factories. And so workers found themselves in a situation where they realized, A, they're going to be workers for all of their life. They're not going to graduate out of that and own their own shops. And second of all, they began to realize that their interests no longer corresponded with the factory owner's interests. It wasn't like the apprentices and the journey workers, had a similar interest to master craftsmen under the old craft system of keeping prices up, limiting the number of people who could go into a trade so that they could keep prices up and quality up. Now it was in this opposition to the factory owners. The factory owners wanted to make as much profit as possible. The workers wanted to get as much compensation for their labor. And so there was this natural antagonism that emerged. And because capital had so much power and so much money at its hands, many workers decided that the only way that they could fight for their rights would be by, joining together into organizations that were big enough to go up against these big capitalist enterprises and industries. And so that's where you get the beginning of the union movement in places like England, Europe, and the United States. And it makes sense to join unions because industrial capitalism weakened workers. They didn't control the means of production. They didn't have an independent ability to make money. They had to sell their labor to the factory owners. And also increasingly with factory production, the value of the skills that they might have had became useless because they no longer were going to craft an entire product like a shoe or something. Now they were simply going to attend machines where anybody could be brought in. You didn't have to have any special skills to do this. And so they were de-skilled. And when they became de-skilled, when it became easy to replace one worker with another, because they didn't need the years of training to become a skilled worker, their ability to demand high wages kind of faded because they could be easily replaced. And so they came to the realization that the only way that they could bargain for a greater share of the wealth that their labor was creating, a greater share than the factory owners were giving them. The only way they could do that was by forming these organizations that could go into the factory owners and demand that the factory owners meet with their representatives, the union leaders, and negotiate with them for better wages, safer working conditions, shorter hours, and that sort of thing. But workers in the Industrial Revolution faced a couple of major problems. One, of course, is that their main tool for forcing factory owners to listen to them and negotiate with their representatives, the only way they could do this was by threatening a strike or actually going out on strike. In other words, denying factory owners their labor. The problem there, of course, was that they could be easily replaced. And of course, factory owners were quite, never hesitated to bring in what they called strike breakers, or what workers called scabs. And that, of course, is what we saw in that article you were reading in the Lowell Mill Girls Go on Strike, where the women, sort of have had enough. Their wages are being cut as competition is forcing factory owners to lower their wages. They've been promised higher wages. They've been promised decent working conditions, and these were gradually being taken away as increasing competition forced the factory owners to, cut back on the share of wealth their factories were creating, the share of wealth that was being given to the women in terms of their wages and in terms of the living conditions. As I said before, many of them lived in these dormitories that were provided for them by the factory owners. And so they, in the case of Harriet Robbins, she describes an early strike in which these young girls go out on strike. But of course, as the piece that you read, as this memoir you read, the strike ultimately failed because it was very easy for factory owners to bring in replacement workers, and they refused to negotiate with the representatives of the women. The working people who tried to organize unions also faced other problems. One was the law and sort of the ideological attitudes of the day. The problem unions faced was not just, as I said, it was not just a practical problem of strike breakers and a reserve army of unemployed who factory owners could always bring in to replace striking workers. They also faced a hostile legal environment. To many people, to many of the factory owners, to people in government, to the middle classes, the professional classes in many of these industrial societies, that is, the non-working classes in these societies. Unions seem to violate basic principles of free markets, capitalism, individual freedom, and even a free society itself. In other words, they saw unions as a threat to a businessman's right to run a business any way he wanted. And there was this attitude that, we're all free individuals and everybody can work for whoever they want. Slavery has been outlawed in the Western world by the middle part of the 19th century, and even in America, one of the last bastions of slavery, by 1865, it's gone. And so the attitude of many people, non-working people, is that workers are free individuals. They choose to work or they don't work. They have freedom of contract. Workers, if they don't like their conditions, they can always quit, or they can, go as individuals to demand better pay from their bosses. But of course, an individual worker has absolutely no bargaining power with a boss. And so what you have emerging is the idea of this doctrine of freedom of contract. Again, that workers, we live in a free society. The owners have the right to hire they want. The workers have the right to work wherever they want. But the reality, of course, is that most workers, because if they have skills, the skills have become obsolete, and many of them never develop skills because there's no need for skills, and they're just basically machine tenders. And they have no real bargaining power, and basically they're forced to work because they have to survive in society. They have to provide for their families, and so they have to take whatever pay these owners are willing to give them. They have to work under any conditions the owners want them to work under, and so again they organize these unions to fight back. But when the unions take actions against the owners and go out on strike, what the owners then claim, and under the law they are allowed to claim, is that the unions are preventing them from doing business as free individuals in society. And what the owners often do is they turn to the government to break these strikes. Well, first they bring in strike. First, the workers go out on strike. They set up picket lines. And there's a lot of industrial strife in the late 19th century because conditions are so awful for workers during the early years and even the middle years of the Industrial Revolution. That strikes are kind of a constant phenomena. Partly it has to do with the volatility of the industrial economy. There's all these ups and downs in the economy when the economy is expanding and then it's contracting. And during periods of contraction, workers are their wages are cut, their hours are increased, and they tend and some of them are pushed to the edge of survival. And when they organize into unions and they go out on strike, of course, the first thing that the factory owners try to do is bring in strike breakers to replace them. Workers oftentimes tried to fight back by setting up these picket lines to prevent them from coming in, but then owners could claim that these workers were basically preventing them from doing business, violating their freedom to conduct business as they saw fit. And the government would use its force to break up these strikes. They would send in, the militias. They would send in police. They would send in even in the army in the case of really big strikes. They would also oftentimes throw injunctions that courts would order the leadership of these unions that were conducting these strikes to stop immediately because they were in violation of the law. And if the unions persisted in maintaining the strikes, they would hit union leaders with massive fines and even jail terms, even throwing them in jail, arresting them because they were violating the owner's right to practice free trade. But by the early years of the 20th century, unions, the attitudes began to change a little bit. In many places, workers increasingly gained the right to vote in late 19th century and early 20th century democracies in Europe. And one of the things that happened there, particularly, for example, in the United Kingdom, the government, as political parties had to appeal to the working classes to get their vote, there was a push for, a more benign government attitude towards unions, and increasingly industrial unions are legalized. In the United Kingdom. In continental Europe, in places like France and Germany, governments actually become partners with unions and big companies. And so the three different groups, government, unions, and industrial leaders, begin to sort of collectively set the terms in order to avoid industrial strife, to avoid strikes, and that sort of thing. In Japan, another model takes form in which the companies themselves set up worker organizations that will speak on behalf of workers. Now, in the United States, things are a little bit slower. Capital is less willing to talk to unions, to deal with unions. And industrial strife continues into the early 20th century, even as unions try to organize industrial workers, for example, workers in the growing automobile and steel industries, sort of the core of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, particularly the second Industrial Revolution of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, when automobiles and steel became, as I said before, the prominent industries. And it wasn't until the great collapse of capitalism in the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States that workers were able to actually make gains and begin to form unions and strike against these large corporations. What happened, of course, was that with sort of the collapse of industrial capitalism during the Great Depression, you get a new government elected under Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal, and they become more sympathetic to worker causes because working people represent the core of the constituency that elects Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Congress. And there is an increasing, and so what the government does is it passes laws that legalize the right of workers to join unions, and workers take advantage of this. And they begin to start striking for higher wages. And mostly the first thing they strike for is to get companies to recognize the union as their representatives. In other words, the companies would have to meet with representatives of the workers, that is the unions, and negotiate better wages, better working conditions, and so on. And in 1936, 1937, one of the most famous strikes in American history, the workers at the GM plants in Michigan decide that rather than picket around the factories, to force General Motors, the biggest corporation in the world at the time, to negotiate with them. What they do instead is they borrow a method that had been used in France, and they decide to sit down in the factories. This kind of forces GM's hands because they don't want to send in they don't want to go in and force these workers out because these workers, there's very valuable equipment and they're worried that the workers might sabotage it. There might be violence inside the factories and very expensive equipment might be destroyed. But most importantly is that GM sort of turns to the government and says, you've got to get these guys out of these factories. You've got to make it illegal. You've got to throw their union leaders in jail. You've got to hit them with fines as the government had previously done. But this time, the leadership in various places, in Michigan, for example, refused to kind of do that. And they cited the new laws that had been passed under Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal, which said that unions have a right to exist and that corporations have to sort of sit down with them and bargain with them. And they basically tell GM, you've got to sit down and bargain with these people. And eventually GM does after a lengthy strike during the winter of 1936, 1937. And there's a recognition of the United Automobile Workers. The similar thing happens in the steel industry. And by the late 1930s, you see a massive increase in unionization in the United States. All of this, of course, in response to the Industrial Revolution. Another thing that begins to improve the conditions of working people in the Western world, besides unionization, which was increasingly became an increasing force in these societies to assure workers getting decent wages and decent working conditions, was just that capitalism itself began to sort of shift away from capital goods, the manufacture of steel, the manufacture of railroads and machine tools and that sort of thing, towards increasing quantities of producing consumer goods. And as capitalism started producing these consumer goods, prices began to fall. There were more abundant goods, and they became more available to working people. And so even if wages weren't rising that much, living conditions were improving because capitalism was providing this wealth of products that were becoming cheaper and more, becoming more affordable to many people, even in the working class. And so that, kind of eased the problem of miserable working conditions in industrialized areas as workers had gained access to new goods that became, more economic, that became lower price and more available to. But even as working people saw their conditions improve through unionization and a more abundant and cheaper consumer goods in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, workers in what we call the developing world and other parts of the world, people in those areas were also hit by industrialization in a negative way. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, if we take China, for example, China was one of the great manufacturing centers of the world. It produced a host of luxury products, and of course, prior to the Industrial Revolution, much, hand manufacturing, handwork, handcraft work was oriented towards the luxury market. China was the center for it. I mean, things like lacquerware, porcelain, silks. China was kind of the workshop of the world in the pre-industrial. Similarly, India was a major center of textiles and woven products. There was a massive handloom and hand weaving industry in India that produced all kinds of textiles for the world prior to the Industrial Revolution. It was the textile production of the world centered on the production of cotton. And in fact, many of our terms for cotton goods like madras and calico and denim are all words that borrowed from India, because they were the first to produce these fabrics, and India was known as the great textile production of the world. But these places faced a number of problems as industrialization proceeded apace in Europe, and so they were hit with a number of problems that sort of overwhelmed these industries in these other parts of the world. One was that increasingly international trade in textile goods from India, the trade in hand manufactured goods in China, was controlled by Europeans. It was transported in European ships. Europeans acted as the middlemen, the merchants, and they were increasingly taking a bigger cut of the wealth that these workers were producing. And so that less of the wealth filtered back to China and India, because Europeans controlled the terms of trade, because it was their ships, their merchants financing this stuff. Then there was industrialization itself. And what begins to happen is that in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and the United States, as industrialization proceeds apace, these basic goods, the basic manufactured goods like dishware and fabrics and textiles and all the things that were made in places like India and China by hand, could not compete with these industrial forces. And they started being outcompeted by these, and it undermined these industries in these places and helped lead to some underdevelopment, a gradual underdevelopment, as Europe and the United States and other industrialized countries like Japan begin to see their national wealth increase rapidly and see the standard of living of their people increase rapidly, while those in India and China decline. In addition to that, European powers in particular, and Japan to some extent as well, and even the United States, used industrialization to create great military forces that allowed them to conquer these territories and establish imperial control over places like India. And even though China wasn't actually imperialized or colonized, as we'll discuss in a couple of weeks, its economy came increasingly under European control. And having control, take India, for example, something we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. In India, Britain passes a series of laws that are basically designed to undermine the textile industry in India. All kinds of tariffs are placed in, all kinds of restrictions on labor are placed in, to both undermine the Indian textile industries, because the British see it as competition to their own, and to allow British machine-made textiles to go in. And so when we speak of the industrialization of the West and Japan and the United States and Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we have to also understand that the process of industrialization in these places leads to kind of an undermining of the manufacturing capacity of places like China and India. And so they kind of go hand in hand. It helps to explain why there becomes such an inequality in wealth between the West and other parts of the world in the 20th century. Something that is only beginning to change in the last few decades as places like East Asia begin to rapidly modernize their economies. And so as we can see that outside of Europe and settler states like the United States, places that were settled by Europeans, only Japan is really the only country in the 19th and early 20th centuries to figure out the key. And by militarizing fast enough, by industrializing fast enough, they're able to keep the Europeans at bay and set their own terms for their own industrialization. Meanwhile, in the 20th century, various parts of the developing world try other paths to industrialization, usually directed by governments. But places like Egypt, Russia, Latin America, all try various industrialization schemes. Some work better than others, but for the most part, they're usually under government direction. But for the most part, they don't work because they don't. And only in recent decades have we begun to see improvements in some of these places, and because what holds them back in many places is that they don't have the well-developed financial markets. They don't have a workforce that's used to high wages that leads to developing new technologies. They don't have a large entrepreneurial class that is seeking profits, and they don't have the legal foundations for free market capitalism. And so, and also they're kind of held back, as we said before, by European militaries and European imperialism, which basically makes it impossible for them to industrialize. And they're faced with a flood of cheap European and manufactured goods that undermine their own handcraft industries. And so it helps to explain why the West advances, as I said before, advances so much more rapidly than the rest of the world. Next week, we will talk about one of the key components of early industrialization, the capital that goes into developing many of the early industries. And that capital, of course, comes from a lot of it comes from the early European imperialist systems and the huge wealth created by the plantation agriculture of the Americas, which, of course, is worked by slave labor from Africa. So next week, we're going to talk about the slave trade. We're talking about slavery in the Western world, particularly in the Americas. And we're going to talk, and then we'll also shift a little bit later to what leads to the end of the slave trade, what leads to the end of slavery in the Americas, and what happens to Africa in the wake of the slave trade and how it becomes conquered by European imperialists in the late 19th century. So now stay tuned for please look at the next frame that I'm going to show you to see the quiz based on today's lecture, and fill that out, send it to me by email, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about the slave trade in Africa in the age of European imperialism. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.